In the episode Sanctuary of the Mandalorian, the titular bounty hunter finds himself defending a farming village from attacking raiders. To do so, he partners with another bounty hunter and teaches the village to fight. He entertains the idea of staying in the village with a woman before leaving. In this film, a wandering cowboy assembles a group of gunslingers to teach a village of farmers how to defend themselves. After the battle, one of the gunslingers stays in the village where he has fallen in love, while the rest ride on. But The Magnificent Seven is itself a remake. Again, a wandering ronin is hired by a village of rice farmers. He assembles a group of samurai, and they teach the villagers to fight. One falls in love with a villager, and the survivors depart. 7 Samurai becomes The Magnificent Seven, which becomes Sanctuary. This pattern between Jidaigeki and Westerns extends. Yojimbo is appropriated almost frame for frame into A Fistful of Dollars. Harakiri becomes Requiem for a Gringo, and Adventures of Zatoichi becomes Blind Man. During the US occupation of Japan after World War II, Jidaigeki were heavily censored in favor of American cinema. The occupational government saw Jidaigeki as violent imperial propaganda pieces. The success of films like Ugetsu and Rashomon, which would later be turned into The Outrage, at international film festivals brought Jidaigeki into the American consciousness, and Japanese cinema began distributing in the US. Western studios saw potential in Americanizing Jidaigeki for domestic audiences, and clearly they did so with ease. As time advanced and the space race turned audiences toward the stars, the Western too moved from the open range into the final frontier. Films like The Valley of Gwanji show early efforts to bring sci-fi to the Western, and decades before The Mandalorian adapted Magnificent Seven, Battle Beyond the Stars did it first. The Western and sci-fi seem like a natural pair. Both rely on the setting of an open, unsettled frontier. But Jidaigeki and the Western also have thematic overlap. Both take advantage of their nation's mythologized history and often feature displaced warriors struggling to adjust to modernization. Some argue that both genres reflect the economic and political shifts in the US and Japan from agricultural market societies to industrialized planned economies. Without much difficulty, one can construct a historically plausible linear model of these genres as a series of cultural transactions. In this model, Jidaigeki films were exported from a politically vulnerable post-war Japan and appropriated into westerns in the United States. From there, they were translated once more into sci-fi to satisfy shifting audience demands in the changing political climate of the space race. However, this model, which posits a one-way transactional flow of influence where the US is the active dominating force and Japan the passive victim, fails to account for the history of Japanese reappropriations of westerns and sci-fi back into Jidaigeki. Consider Akira Kurosawa's Sanjuro, which lifts many of the structural beats of Shame. A wandering warrior reluctantly takes on a young mentor, partakes in a deadly final duel, then departs. Even more explicitly, Unforgiven was directly adapted into Yudu Sarezaru Mono in 2013. There's also Sukiyaki Western Django, a prototypical cowboy flick made by a Japanese cast and crew. Even the Jidaigeki that influenced the cowboy films of the 50s and 60s find their roots in Western influence. Akira Kurosawa famously drew inspiration from the films of John Ford, and as early as the 1920s, westerns like The Mask of Zorro were being reimagined as Jidaigeki. In fact, the Japanese imperial government at one point banned Jidaigeki production because they were deemed to be too Western. Clearly, the relationship between samurai and cowboy is more complicated than a one-way transaction. Their relationship to science fiction is no different. Star Wars began as a film that drew inspiration from both Jidaigeki like The Hidden Fortress as well as Western gunslingers. But in 2021, a group of Japanese animation studios released Star Wars Visions, a series of shorts that took the franchise back to its roots. Films like Blade Runner incorporate Japanese influence into their sci-fi futures, and from the 90s to the 2000s to today, hybrids between the Western and science fiction continue to please. Limiting these genres to a linear, one-way progression of influence ignores the rich history of cultural dialogue between the US and Japan, and risks confining Japanese cinema to the role of a passive commodity for Western consumption. It also ignores the contributions of Jidaigeki remakes of Westerns. Takashi Fujitani argues that the reappropriation of the Western back into Jidaigeki is both an act of cultural dialogue and of recentering marginalized voices. Yuru Sarezaru Mono, for example, heavily expands on the role of women and indigenous people compared to Unforgiven. Rather than the linear model of influence, which is historically convenient but ultimately rigid and limited, perhaps we ought to consider these genres as nodes on a distributed web of influence, in which each genre is entangled in its wider transnational context. More than a mere series of appropriations, these genres become a site of an ongoing cultural dialogue between the US and Japan, in which both nations play an active role. The result of this web is a more dynamic understanding of transnational cinema, one that brings back into focus marginalized voices and accounts for counter-hegemonic reappropriations of cinema.